Good morning. My name is Dave Beaudoin, a project lead with Ballotpedia. Although there was significant attention on Tuesday's 470 congressional elections, there were also contests at the state level for governors, some down-ballot state executive offices like state attorney general, and many state legislative chambers. Although some of those races remain too close to call at this point, we thought it would be a great time to look at how Tuesday's results will impact governing at the state level in 2019 and beyond. Today we'll be talking about state government trifectas and the outcome of both gubernatorial and state legislative elections. To help me do that, joining me here today is Rob Oldham, a staff writer on our marquee team here at Ballotpedia. Rob, thanks for taking the time to talk with me today.
Great to be here, Dave.
Remember, if you have any questions for Rob or myself throughout the webinar, please drop them in the Zoom chat. We will also have a brief period at the end of the session where you'll be able to ask them as well. So Rob, one of the ways we at Ballotpedia describe control of state government by the particular parties is through the term trifecta. So what exactly is that?
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. It's just a state government where one party controls the governor's office, the state house, and the state senate.
And going into Tuesday's elections, Republicans held trifectas in a majority of states, is that right?
That's right. Republicans had 26 trifectas, Democrats had 8, and there were 16 divided governments. So this actually changed a little bit after since the end of the 2016 elections. After those elections, Republicans had 25 trifectas, Democrats had 6, and there were 19 divided governments. But then throughout 2017, Republicans picked up one trifecta when the governor of West Virginia changed his party affiliation from Democratic to Republican. And then the Democrats picked up New Jersey and Washington trifectas in the 2017 elections.
Got it. Now, there's multiple ways that a state government trifecta can be created or broken, correct? You just mentioned one in your last answer.
Right, yeah, so essentially the governor's seat can change hands, or a party can flip control of one or both legislative chambers in a state.
So based on the results that we have so far, how did Tuesday's elections change these numbers? How many states saw their status change?
So far, we know for sure that 10 states have seen a trifecta change. There were 6 Democratic flips, so divided governments that became Democratic trifectas. These were Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Nevada, New Mexico, and New York. And then there were 4 states that became, where Republicans lost their trifectas. These were Kansas, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin. There are 3 states that we're not completely sure of the result yet. That is Georgia, Florida, and Alaska. In Georgia and Florida, the governor's races have not been totally finalized yet, although the Republicans lead in both of those. And then in Alaska, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we don't know exactly who will control the state house there. There's still some uncalled races, and then also Alaska can be a little funky because of coalition governments that form. So we're not completely sure, but it looks like all 3 of those will likely go Republican at this point. But before we call those, it looks like there will be at least 20 Republican trifectas, 14 Democratic trifectas, and 13 states under divided government when we get started with legislative sessions in 2019.
Now, you mentioned it before, or just now, that sometimes control of a legislative chamber doesn't always correspond to the party identification of the majority of the members. And that's because of what you referred to as coalitions. Can you talk about, I think in New York, that happened for a while. Can you give a little background on that?
Sure, that's a great example to bring up too. And it's a pretty complicated, so I'll try to keep it simple for everybody. So the New York Senate, between 2012 and 2016, Republicans were in control of the chamber, even though Democrats usually had more senators than Republicans during those 4 years. And the reason for this is because there were 9 Democrats, which was 8 members of what was called the Independent Democratic Caucus, and then another senator named Simcha Felder, who caucused with the Republicans, even though they had been elected as Democrats. So this basically ended before the 2018 elections. The IDC the Independent Democratic Caucus members, they rejoined the Democrats in April, but then most of them were defeated in the September primaries by more liberal Democrats who were angry at them for caucusing with the Republicans. And so Republicans were hoping that they could keep a one-seat majority in the chamber by holding all the seats they had, but then also maintaining this alliance with Simca Felder, who survived his September primary. But they ended up losing about 7, maybe 8 seats on Tuesday night, which looks like that is going to marginalize Felder and the 2 IDC members that survived the September primaries. And so it looks like the Democrats are going to take a full majority in New York, which will only be the second time that they've done that since the early 1960s. The first was in the 2008 elections.
It's amazing that the Democrats have not been in the majority in that chamber very much over that period, because we all think of New York as a pretty blue state. You also said that there's a similar type dynamic happening in the Alaska House, right?
Right. So Alaska is somehow even more bizarre than New York. So in Alaska, you have what are called Bush Democrats, and they often come from rural areas of Alaska, and they tend to caucus with the Republicans. And then you have a group of Republicans who tend to come from often more urban areas, sometimes around Anchorage, and they're called Musk Ox Republicans, and they often caucus with Democrats. So in a kind of similar situation to what we saw in New York, in 2016, Republicans won a majority of seats in the chamber, but the Democrats, a couple of independents, and 3 Muskox Republicans, they formed a coalition because they all supported a state income tax, which Alaska currently doesn't have. And so that kept the Republicans out of the majority, and Alaska's had a Democratic speaker for the last 2 years. But now Republicans are saying that they won enough seats there on Tuesday where they're going to be able to organize the majority next year. But, it's Alaska, so who really knows what's going to happen?
I absolutely love these kind of stories. The best part about them is the realization that politics isn't always about national party labels. As a country, our elections are becoming so much more nationalized, but it's really kind of refreshing to realize that the personalities and political and economic interests can be much more prominent than party labels at the state or local levels. I think these stories are awesome. Anyway, in talking about trifectas, the overall outcome then of Tuesday's elections is that more states will have trifecta control in 2019, with there being more Democratic trifectas, fewer Republican ones, and only about a quarter of states with divided government. So with 2020 around the corner, this all has implications relating to the upcoming census, correct?
It absolutely does. The 2020 census is where we're going to find how many U.S. House districts each state gets, and then after we find that number out, the state legislatures in a lot of cases will redraw these lines, and that's going to determine which party will have a structural advantage in U.S. House elections for the next decade. So very important. For example, in 2010, the GOP won a lot of elections, and that allowed them to control redistricting across many states for this decade. So right now, there are 34 states where state legislatures draw congressional lines, and this is excluding Ohio, Michigan, and Colorado, which all very recently passed measures to change the redistricting process, and it actually might include Utah as well. We're still waiting to hear the final results of a new redistricting measure that was on the ballot there on Tuesday night. So that means if nothing else changes in 2020, we will have 14 to 16 Republican trifectas redrawing congressional lines, 8 Democratic trifectas redrawing lines, and 10 to 12 divided governments drawing lines. So just to review how that's going to affect some of the bigger states that, of course, have a significant number of House districts. New York and Illinois will both have Democratic trifectas. Texas, Florida, and Georgia, depending on the outcomes of those 2 gubernatorial races, will have Republican trifectas. Pennsylvania will be under divided government. Ohio, actually, in May 2018, they passed a bipartisan redistricting procedure, So it's not quite an independent commission, but it still will not be a completely partisan redrawing of the lines like we'll likely see in some of these other states. California and Michigan will both use independent commissions, and the Michigan Independent Commission was one of the measures that actually passed Tuesday night. And North Carolina actually is a place where the legislature will draw the lines, but the governor does not have the power to veto. So even though North Carolina is under divided government right now with a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, it looks like the governor won't be able to veto the lines. Democrats will not be able to influence the lines unless they take back one of the state chambers in 2020.
This is all great analysis, and actually shows a real nice intertwining of both the results at the state government level and how it could impact Congress. I know we tend to think about state government elections and how they affect state issues, policies, taxes, those kind of things. But every 10 years, we also have the redrawing of the district lines, both at the congressional and in most cases at the state legislative level. And, that has a very big impact as well. So that's the facts about trifectas are very, very important on both those levels. All right, let's switch to talk about the chief executive officer in each state, the governor. Each cycle, almost 3/4 of all governors are elected in the midterms rather than during presidential election years. So we had a lot of results on Tuesday. What was the party composition of these governors going into the 2018 elections?
Right. So out of the 50 governors, we had 33 Republicans, 16 Democrats, and 1 independent governor. That was Bill Walker in Alaska. On Tuesday, there were 26 Republican governorships up for election, 9 Democratic governorships, and Walker's Alaska seat. So pretty notably, 26 of these races were open seats. 26 were open. 13 of the seats were actually term limited. So that was 2 Democrats and 11 Republicans. And so that means only 6 Republicans and 4 Democratic incumbents were seeking re-election. Walker had been seeking re-election, but he actually dropped his bid in mid-October after he had a Democrat and a Republican running on both sides of him. So he didn't feel like he had a reasonable chance to win that race. So yeah, basic point there were a lot of open seats last night. So a lot of chances for partisan changes.
And what was the outcome of Tuesday's elections? How many of these governor seats changed parties?
We've had 8 changes so far, and Georgia and Florida are still possible. So one of these changes was in Alaska, where Walker's seat went to the Republican Mike Dunleavy, and the other 7 were Republican governorships going to the Democrats. So that was in Illinois, Kansas, Maine, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wisconsin. So in 2019, we will have at least 26 Republicans and at least 23 Democrats. And then, we'll have at least 25 Republicans if we're not counting Florida. So Florida and Georgia will determine kind of which party gets those last 2 seats.
But we are getting a little bit closer to almost parity between the 2 parties. I know for the longest period of time, it was almost 2/3, 1/3, or even as close as 3/4, 1/4. So the Democrats did make some significant gains on Tuesday. What is the current situation with the gubernatorial race in Georgia? Is that the only race that hasn't been called?
So yeah, and so Georgia hasn't been called, and then Florida was called, but then it looks like after some vote tightening happened, Democratic candidate Andrew Gillum has rescinded his concession. So I would say both of those right now, the outcome is at least somewhat uncertain. So first, in Georgia, it looks like the Republican, Brian Kemp, has the edge, and the Democrat, Stacey Abrams, who, if she was elected, would be the first Black woman elected as a governor in the country's history. She will have to considerably shrink Kemp's margin in order to get him below 50% of the vote. If she is able to do this, then there will actually be a runoff between Kemp and Abrams on December 4th. Kemp actually has already declared victory, though, and he has already started to kind of prepare to assume office, and he resigned his current position, which was Secretary of State of Georgia. So more to come on that. For the Florida race, like I said, Gillum conceded to the Republican candidate, Ron DeSantis, on election night. But then kind of overnight, the vote tightened, and it looks like DeSantis's margin over Gillum is below a 0.5 percentage point. And in Florida, if you're below 0.5 percentage point, that leads to an automatic machine recount of the election results. Now, if you get lower than that, if you get down to 0.25 percentage point, that leads to a manual recount of election results. And it looks like that's actually going to happen in the Florida Senate race between the outgoing governor, Rick Scott, and Democratic incumbent Bill Nelson. So it looks like we're going to have 2 recounts in Florida coming. Possibly the governor's race will be machine and the Senate race will be a hand recount. So we'll see what happens with those, and if they do happen, if the results change anything. It's typically pretty difficult for a recount to change an election result, but it's Florida. There's a long history of recounts there, and so we'll see what happens.
Everybody who was up late in 2000 on election night and that saga that went on with the Florida hand recount of the presidential race was there were just some visuals of that will never be forgotten. So there are definitely some crazy things that happen with Florida's elections. I guess because the state is so close between the two parties, it tends to promote these things happening. So those were 2 governor's elections, which really drew some significant national attention. And then there were some others that were also pretty prominent, such as Wisconsin, Kansas. Which result was the most unexpected in your eyes in the governor's races?
So I personally was pretty surprised by Kansas, where Democrat Laura Kelly defeated the Republican Secretary of State, Chris Kobach. I was surprised both by the margin, which was a 4-point win for Kelly at this point at least, and the fact that the race was called pretty early. It wasn't, we weren't sitting up biting our nails waiting to hear the next election return. The reasons I was surprised was that Kansas is a very Republican state. It voted for Trump by over 20 points in 2016. And also there was an independent on the ballot, and we were kind of thinking that he was going to draw more votes away from Kelly, because in 2014, his name's Greg Orman, and he ran against the Republican Senator Pat Roberts, and he basically ran as the Democratic candidate in that race. So it was pretty remarkable that Kelly was, able to overcome that and beat Kobach. Probably some of the reasons for that was Kobach has been a pretty controversial in his role as Secretary of State. He's been tied to the Trump administration and has drawn some headlines for his involvement in voter fraud. Not his personal involvement with voter fraud, but kind of some efforts to, to crack down on voter fraud. He also had beat the Republican incumbent in a pretty nasty primary. It was a pretty narrow win, so he came out of that already a little bit bruised. And actually, a bunch of former Republican governors ended up endorsing Kelly in the race over him. And he was running on the tail of Sam Brownback's governorship. So Brownback was the Kansas governor who was first elected in 2010. And during his governorship, you saw cuts to education funding and the cuts to taxes that kind of made, it made it a tough environment for Kobach to run in. So those are probably some of the reasons that Kelly was able to overcome some of the other disadvantages she had in the race. I was also pretty surprised by Florida. Andrew Gillum had led Ron DeSantis in almost all pre-election polls. But, in hindsight, those leads were usually pretty narrow and often within the margin of error. So perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised as I was by how close that race was and the fact that DeSantis will likely prevail.
Yeah, I was surprised by the Florida one as well. I mean, I know the leads were, as you said, were pretty narrow, but usually when you have a consistent number of polls that all kind of say the same thing, usually those tend to be right. But we'll see if the outcome changes in a recount. But as you said, that's very difficult to happen. So, yeah, those were all fascinating governor's races that happened on Tuesday. Now let's take a look at the state legislatures, which is the other side of the trifecta equation. There are 93 state legislative chambers in the United States. Nebraska only has a state senate, and 87 of those 99 held elections on Tuesday. And the total number of seats that were up for election was 6,073. Going into Tuesday's elections, what was the breakdown in party control for these chambers and for these seats?
So Republicans held 67 chambers and 4,134 seats. Democrats held 32 chambers and 3,123 seats. So Republicans had basically 68% of the chambers, and 56% of seats. And so the reason that they had such a big advantage going into elections was because they dominated state races during the Obama years. From 2009 to 2016, they actually flipped just a little under 1,000 legislative seats. So that set them up pretty well to have a successful, to be in a position of dominance last night, and also to give Democrats some room to gain seats.
And given that the state legislative districts are generally smaller than congressional districts, obviously some of these contests have yet to be formally called or formally decided. But do we have a current number for how many seats each party won, or how many seats changed hands on Tuesday?
So Ballotpedia is still calculating the final number, but it looks like Democrats probably picked up around 300, maybe closer to 350 seats. We will have a final number likely, today or maybe sometime next week, but that's what it's looking like right now. So pretty significant gains for Democrats.
Now, the number of seats won is interesting for people like us who love data, but where this really impacts the governing process, as we talked about in the trifectas section, is where it causes the party control of a chamber to flip. And based on what we know now, how many of these state legislative chambers changed hands this week?
Democrats flipped 6 chambers. So that was the Colorado Senate, the Maine Senate, the Minnesota House, the New York Senate, and then both chambers of the New Hampshire state legislature. And it looks like Republicans probably flipped the Alaska House, but again, with the uncalled races and the potential coalition formation there, I wouldn't feel totally confident in saying that yet, but it looks pretty likely at this point.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting is that despite all the talk about the gains that the Democrats had in Congress and obviously flipping control of the House of Representatives, the number of chambers, 7, that switched partisan control this year is less than the midterm elections under President Obama in 2010 and 2014. Back in 2010, 22 state legislative chambers flipped control. All but one of them went from Democrat to Republican. So that means that 21 chambers went Democrat to Republican, and just one went the other way. And then in 2014, which was, in Obama's second term, there were 9 chambers that switched control, and all of those went from Democrat to Republican. So it kind of gives you a sense as to what kind of advantage going in terms of control of chambers Republicans had going into these elections in 2018.
Just a brief note on that. I think something that's interesting there in 2010 is that Republicans were flipping a lot of chambers that, based off national results, you would have expected to be, for them to control a long time before that. So, for example, Alabama, as a Republican of a state as you can think of, that first time that it went to Republican control was 2010. So a lot of correction that really hadn't happened before when those states started voting Republican at the presidential level really kind of came to fruition in 2010.
Right. That was definitely the realignment, the final realignment of party affiliation, generally in the South, but in a few other places as well, for sure. I don't know which narrative Tuesday's results fit into with the fact that the number of chambers that flipped, but Democrats can still take comfort in the fact that they only really lost one and did flip a half a dozen. One other thing I wanted to touch on briefly is the concept in state government of supermajorities, where one party has a large enough control in both chambers of the state legislature that they can either override the governor's veto, or in some cases they can achieve some legally prescribed vote threshold for things like changing chamber procedures or raising taxes, that kind of stuff. In cases where the governor is of one party and the supermajority control in the legislature is of the other party, it can really diminish the powers of the governor. Were there any states where that situation existed heading into the elections, and did Tuesday's results change that in any way?
So you can see on our map that heading into the election, there were 3 states that had a supermajority and then a governor of the opposite party. So Maryland and Massachusetts both had Republican governors who were both reelected Tuesday night and Democratic supermajorities. And it looks like those were probably both preserved, even though Republicans had tried to break the Democratic supermajority in the Maryland Senate. Does not look like they were successful. And then we have North Carolina. So North Carolina had a Republican supermajority and a Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, and Democrats actually broke the Republican supermajority. So this is where all the action and attention was if you're someone who's interested in legislative supermajorities. This goes all the way back to the 2016 governor's election. So Roy Cooper beat the incumbent Republican, Pat McCrory, in that election. And then almost immediately, Cooper came into conflict with the Republican legislature. The legislature worked with McCrory to limit the governor's powers during a December 2016 lame duck session. And then after Cooper formally assumed the governorship, the supermajority continued to pass bills that either limited his powers or went against his priorities. They often overrode his vetoes of this legislation. And so it was actually a very big deal for Democrats to break this supermajority, because now they've made it so that Cooper can't be overridden unless at least some Democratic legislators agree with the veto override. So it's definitely changed the dynamic there. A quick aside on that is that one of the reasons Democrats did so well in these elections and were able to break the supermajority is because a federal court recently struck down the state House and state Senate maps used in 2016 after ruling that some of the districts were gerrymandered based off race. So after some back and forth with the Republican legislature, the court actually had a Stanford law professor, Nathan Persily, redraw the map, and it ended up being a little bit more favorable to Democrats. So that's a big reason why they did better in 2018 than they had in 2016 and some of the prior elections. Anyhow, we have a lot of information on Ballotpedia about the conflict between Cooper and the Republican legislature, so go check it out if you haven't already. And also be on the lookout for more conflicts like the one in North Carolina. I've already heard some talk in Wisconsin that the legislature might have a lame duck session to try to strip some of the governor's power before Democrat Tony Evers, who defeated Republican Scott Walker, will assume the governorship in January. So we'll see if that comes to fruition or not. But I'd expect that these types of conflicts will only grow more numerous in coming years rather than less so.
Yeah, I saw that same note that you did about Wisconsin. It looks like the state assembly speaker Voss made some reference to wanting to pass some bills, and they weren't sure whether or not the state Senate leader, who was also a Republican, was on board with doing something. But you're right, that is a situation that bears watching in Wisconsin, whether or not they try during this 2-month period before Evers takes office for any kind of legislation to be passed. This has all been a ton of amazing information, Rob. Thank you very much for sharing all this insight with us. We did have a question actually where someone said that there was a whole lot of facts and figures that you had presented throughout the whole course of the presentation, and whether or not the slides or some of this information would be available to kind of be reviewed later. I think we do make a recording of the presentation available, and I think there's a way we can kind of add some additional information to some of the slides with some of the details. So we'll try to work on that as well.
On that note, too, I'll say that if you have any specific information that you want, feel free to email me at rob.oldham@ballotpedia.org. And I'll also drop that email in the chat real quick. And feel free to ask me any questions that you have. And I'll try to either direct you to where it is on the site or just answer them myself.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thanks, Rob. All right. Well, election nights never disappoint, and this year was certainly no exception. And of course, we're continuing to follow the 2018 elections. As we have discussed here, there are a handful of races which may require recounts. We've talked about a few of them already in this webinar. There's also some congressional House races, which I think people are at least wanting to make sure that the full provisional and absentee ballots are counted, and maybe some of those will go to recounts. So at Ballotpedia, we'll be continuing to cover those. And finally, there are several states which conduct their voting by mail, like California, Colorado, Washington. So those results will continue to come in. And at Ballotpedia, we'll continue to monitor all these developments, and we'll have updated and final results when they're available. And then additionally, we have runoff elections coming in the next month in Georgia. Not sure about the governor's race, but the Secretary of State's race will definitely be going to a runoff. And there's also a special election for the U.S. Senate seat in Mississippi. What are the dates of those runoffs, Rob, that are coming up?
So the Mississippi runoff will be on November 27th, and the Georgia runoff will be on December 4th.
Okay. And if that's not too much election overload, there will be lots of political activity in 2019. There's significant mayoral races coming up in Chicago, for example. There's 3 potentially interesting gubernatorial races in the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Kentucky. And there's also maneuvering for the 2020 elections for the House, the Senate, and of course the presidency. Now, Rob, we also had one last question pop in here. I don't know if you can see it on the chat. Basically, the question is, looking at some of the amendments that were put on the ballot, do you see kind of any national tendency across the states to be looking at kind of like, I guess, election security, or just kind of like the overall redistricting initiatives? Is there any clear pattern that's emerging on these?
Yes, it looks to me like that question is related to amendments, which is admittedly not my specialty at Ballotpedia. We have a ballot measures team that probably would know more about that than I would. So again, feel free to send me an email if you have something specific you want to know, rob.oldham@ballotpedia.org, and I can try to connect you with some more information on that. Or if you are interested in just judicial elections in general, I know there were some pretty interesting ones on a Tuesday night. For example, the North Carolina judicial election, there were 2 Republicans and a Democrat running. One of the Republicans was an incumbent, actually, and the Republicans ended up splitting the vote in half, and the Democrat was elected. So there, a situation like that. There were some other interesting judicial elections in Arizona and California, and so I might not be able to answer whether it's a preservation or reinforcement of independence from democratic norms. That's maybe more of a normative question that we at Ballotpedia tend to address. We tend to focus just on the facts. But again, feel free to send me a note, and I can try to connect you with people that might be able to answer that.
All right. Thank you very much, Rob.
We have one more question too from Andrew. Are there any new supermajorities now? So there are possibly new supermajorities in states where the governor is of the same party. So for example, there's probably a supermajority in Alabama now, even though the KIV, the governor, is a Republican. So that makes it a little less interesting because there's less conflict. But we're still crunching the numbers on state legislatures to see how many seats each party gained exactly. So at some point, we will be updating a page that we have about veto-proof legislatures, and we will, be able to send out and tell everybody, exactly which states have supermajorities and which do not. But at this point, it looks like Maryland and Massachusetts are the only states that are going to have supermajorities and opposite party governors.
which is really where the most of the dynamic of a supermajority really comes into play, where one party can basically kind of minimize the authority of the other party, right?
Yeah, you know, Kansas, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with that number in Kansas as well. But Kansas, because of the factional conflict you have within the Republican Party there, it makes it a little less of a solid Republican versus Democratic conflict. It becomes more of a conservative Republican versus moderate Republican and Democratic conflict. We also have a question from Shannon. So, what can one be thinking, doing about in terms of making the 2020 census as well run and complete as possible? Dave, do you have an answer to that?
Well, I mean, I think there is, the process for doing the 2020 census should be in full swing. I know there's the most prominent story is the discussion about the citizenship question that's being added, and whether or not that will make the final census, I don't know. I think that's making its way through the courts. So the executive branch has pretty wide latitude over the conducting of the census. So I know that, like I said, there have been legal challenges, and how those will get resolved, I'm not really too sure. But I would imagine a big chunk of the preparation for that is underway now. And it'll just have to see how it gets implemented, I guess.
I would say one thing that if you were thinking about the 2020 census and the redistricting that happens afterwards, one thing you can do is pay attention to state legislative elections and gubernatorial elections. They're very important, as we covered earlier, for how these lines and these new districts end up being drawn. So, pay attention, share Ballotpedia content with your friends and family and coworkers and acquaintances, and let them know that even though these elections can seem inconsequential, and you might not even know the name of your state legislator, right? I don't think most Americans do. It's critical information for what our political makeup is going to look like for the next decade. So that's definitely something I would encourage you to do.
Absolutely, I second that as well. Well, this has been a fantastic webinar, Rob. Thanks again for all of your insight, and we covered some really interesting topics about state government. So hopefully it was able to bring to folks the concept of how important, as you even just mentioned, how important some of these critical elections are. We invite you to continue to visit ballotpedia.org for all the news about politics, and keep in the know with our email newsletters. We have a newsletter called The Daily Brew, which comes out every Monday through Friday, and we also have 2 weekly newsletters called The Tap. One is a federal edition, and the other is a state and local edition, and those are all free, and we invite you to sign up for them so that you can continue to be informed. Thanks again, Rob, and thanks everyone
Dave,
for watching.
real quick, we have one more question from Nina
Okay.
just came in. And Nina, I would again encourage you to email me. This seems like this is related to some of the amendments that were on the ballot. Email me and I can put you in touch with people that might know more about those amendments than I do. But thank you very much.
Okay, great. And we really appreciate the questions, everyone. It's awesome to have a webinar with folks that are listening and engaged and asking questions. So we really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.